Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're packing our journals, loading our keelboat, and heading deep into the American wilderness on a journey that would define a nation. We're following the muddy, dangerous, and awe-inspiring trail of Lewis and Clark, two captains tasked by a president to map the unknown, to treat with sovereign nations, and to find a mythical water route to the Pacific that might not even exist. This isn't just a story about exploration, it's about survival, ambition, cultural collision, and the very first steps into the American West. So, before we push off from the riverbank, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these epic deep dives into history. And as always, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always incredible to see our global community gathering for these adventures. Now, dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft river breeze hum, and let's ease into tonight's monumental journey with the cause of discovery. In 1803, the United States pulled off one of the most astonishing and landscape-altering real estate deals in all of history, with the stroke of a pen and the exchange of $15 million a bargain. Even then, President Thomas Jefferson bought a colossal, vaguely defined piece of land from Napoleonic France, the Louisiana Territory. This wasn't a tidy parcel of land with surveyed borders. This was over 800,000 square miles of uncharted wilderness, a vast, mysterious expanse stretching from the muddy banks of the Mississippi River all the way to the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains and, presumably, beyond. Jefferson, a man of insatiable scientific curiosity and grand national vision, was thrilled. This massive acquisition would, he believed, provide near-endless room for the young republic's westward expansion, secure control over vital trade routes like the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, and solidify America's destiny as a continental power. But there was one rather significant problem. Nobody in the U.S. government really knew what was out there. The maps of the time were a patchwork of guesswork, myth, and speculation. Rumors swirled in the halls of Washington and the taverns of the frontier about what lay in the great unknown. Were there still herds of woolly mammoths roaming the plains? Were the Rocky Mountains a single, manageable ridge or an impassable wall of granite? And most tantalizingly, did a direct, navigable water route to the Pacific Ocean? The mythical Northwest Passage that European explorers had sought for centuries actually exist. Finding such a route would revolutionize trade with Asia and cement American dominance over the continent. Jefferson needed answers, and he needed them fast. He envisioned an expedition that was part military reconnaissance, part scientific odyssey, and part diplomatic mission. He wanted to turn that vast, blank map into something tangible, something real, something American. For this unprecedented and incredibly dangerous task, Jefferson turned to a man he knew and trusted implicitly, Meriwether Lewis. Lewis was not only Jefferson's personal secretary, but also a former army captain, a skilled woodsman, and a man who possessed a deep, almost obsessive curiosity for science and the natural world. He was introspective, intelligent, and prone to moods of melancholy. But he was also resilient and fiercely dedicated. Lewis, knowing he could not lead such a monumental undertaking alone, chose his old friend and military comrade, William Clark, to co-lead the journey. The two men were a study in contrasts. Where Lewis was the pensive scientist and diplomat, Clark was the steady, pragmatic frontiersman, an expert cartographer, a skilled outdoorsman, and a natural leader with an easy rapport with the men under his command. Jefferson saw the brilliance in the pairing. They balanced each other perfectly. Their mission was clear, yet impossibly complex: to explore the Missouri River to its source, cross the continental divide, and find the most direct water route to the Pacific. But they were tasked with more than just map-making. They were instructed to be diplomats, establishing peaceful relations with the numerous native tribes they would encounter. They were to be naturalists, documenting every new species of plant and animal, and they were to be geographers, recording the climate, the soil, and the landscape. In short, they were to be the eyes and ears of a young, ambitious nation. But let's be absolutely clear, this was not going to be a gentle stroll through the woods. The expedition, which would become known as the Corps of Discovery, would carry them thousands of miles through untamed rivers, dense forests, scorching plains, and snow-choked mountains. There would be no supply station, no GPS, no rescue helicopters, no lifelines back to civilization. There was only the gear they could carry, their handwritten journals, their unwavering iron determination, and the fervent hope that the Pacific Ocean lay somewhere out there, waiting in the misty, unknown expanse of the American West. The stage was set. A young nation had just purchased a vast mystery, and two captains were about to step into it, armed with little more than courage, Jefferson's blessing, and a mandate to change the face of the continent forever. Before they could step foot into the sprawling wilderness of the Louisiana Territory, Lewis and Clark had to build a team. This wasn't a call for casual travelers or weekend adventurers. They needed a crew of men who could not only survive but thrive under the most grueling conditions imaginable. They needed men who could row upstream against a powerful current for weeks on end, hunt their own food in unfamiliar territory, repair broken equipment with limited tool, fight if necessary, and perhaps, most challenging of all, get along in cramped, close quarters with absolutely no privacy for months, possibly years on end. In short, they needed men who were tough enough to survive anything the continent could throw at them. This elite group, handpicked for their skills and resilience, would be known forever in American history as the Corps of Discovery. In the cold, damp winter of 1803 to 1804, the recruitment and training process began. Lewis and Clark established their base camp, Camp Dubois, on the eastern side of the Mississippi River, just north of St. Louis. This rough-hewn outpost would serve as their intensive training ground and final staging area before they plunged into the unknown. They recruited primarily from Army outposts, seeking out hardy frontiersmen, skilled riflemen, and disciplined soldiers who understood the chain of command. Most of the men who signed on were in their 20s, single, and possessed a potent mix of courage and a youthful hunger for adventure. Among them were key figures like George Drouillard, a master tracker, hunter, and interpreter of French and Native American heritage, whose skills would prove invaluable. Sergeant John Ordway, a strict but capable, non-commissioned officer, was chosen to help enforce discipline and keep detailed records. The expedition also included skilled blacksmiths, carpenters to repair the boats, expert hunters to feed the party, and even musicians like Pierre Cruzat, a one-eyed fiddler, whose tunes were intended to boost morale during long, monotonous evenings. Each recruit swore a solemn oath, dedicating themselves to the expedition's success. This wasn't just a private scouting party. It was an official arm of the U.S. government, a military unit carrying the scientific and geopolitical hopes of a growing nation on its shoulders. The preparations were exhaustive. Supplies were no less essential than the men themselves. The crew loaded a custom-built 55-foot keelboat, a robust vessel, complete with a sail for favorable winds, 22 oars for the upstream battle, and a small cabin for storage and shelter. Alongside this main vessel were two smaller flat-bottom boats called pirogues. They packed an arsenal of trade goods intended as diplomatic offerings for the native tribes they would encounter. Vibrant glass beads, sharp knives, small mirrors, kettles, and most importantly, specially minted silver peace medals bearing President Jefferson's image. These were paired with scientific instruments for mapping and data collection, including compasses, sextants, and telescopes. And, of course, they packed weapons, state-of-the-art rifles, muskets, gunpowder sealed in lead canisters, and over 200 pounds of ink and paper to document their findings in journals. The men drilled relentlessly every day throughout that long winter. They practiced rowing in unison, sailing the keelboat against the current, and portaging heavy equipment. They honed their marksmanship. They learned how to work together, how to follow orders without question, and how to build the unshakable trust in their captains that would be their greatest asset in the trials ahead. Discipline was military strict. Any sign of insubordination or desertion could be met with a flogging. But out of this harsh training, a powerful unity was forged. By May of 1804, the Corps of Discovery was finally ready, over 40 men strong. They prepared to set off up the Missouri River, rowing against the current, into a land that few Americans had ever seen. It was the beginning of a journey that would take them over towering mountains, through dozens of sovereign tribal nations, and all the way to the distant shores of the Pacific Ocean, or so they hoped, with every ounce of their being. The great unknown was waiting. On May 14th, 1804, the Corps of Discovery officially departed from Camp Dubois, pushing their heavily laden keelboat into the murky, swirling waters of the Missouri River. This was the start of what would become a 2.5-year odyssey into a continent that, on American maps, was little more than a vast, empty space. For the men on board, it was the beginning of something legendary. Though they had no real conception of how long the journey would last, the immense distances they would cover, or the profound challenges they were about to face. The terrain ahead was largely uncharted by Americans. The maps they carried were speculative at best. Almost everything they would encounter would be a matter of discovery and guesswork. The first stretch of the expedition, heading north through what is now Missouri, was immediately and unrelentingly grueling. The Missouri River, which they dubbed the Big Muddy, was their main highway westward. But it was a highway that fought them every inch of the way. Its powerful current, often running at 5 or 6 miles per hour, worked tirelessly against them. Each day was a blur of exhausting, back-breaking labor. The men would spend hours pulling the heavy keelboat upstream with ropes from the riverbanks, a process known as cordelling. They would push against the riverbed with long poles, or hoist the single sail when the wind rarely cooperated. The river was a minefield of hidden dangers, shifting sandbars that could ground the boat for hours, submerged logs known as sawyers that could tear a hole in the hull, and swarms of biting mosquitoes and gnats that descended in thick, maddening clouds. This was all under the sweltering heat of a Midwestern summer. Yet, even in those brutal early days, Lewis and Clark made it abundantly clear that this was not just a voyage of endurance. It was a mission of science. Every evening, no matter how exhausted the men were, the captains would meticulously record their observations. They documented new plant species, described the behaviors of animals they encountered, noted weather patterns, and charted the river's changing conditions. They sketched detailed maps, measured distances with survey chains and celestial readings, and preserved specimens. They weren't just exploring. They were methodically documenting the new American frontier for a president and a nation hungry for knowledge. As they moved north, the Corbers passed through lands that were already home to numerous Native American tribes, complex societies that had lived along these rivers and plains for generations and knew the landscape intimately. The expedition's first major diplomatic interaction came in late July with the Oto and Missouri tribes near present-day Nebraska. The meeting was a formal, carefully orchestrated affair, heavy with symbolism and unspoken tension. Clark presented gifts and the Jefferson Peace Medals, while Lewis, through interpreters, delivered a speech explaining the United States' new claims of sovereignty over the territory, a concept that many Native leaders likely viewed with a mix of confusion and deep skepticism. For now, however, diplomacy prevailed. The Corps pressed onward, deeper into the heart of the continent. The wildlife became both a source of wonder and a constant threat. Grizzly bears, a species unknown to most Easterners, proved to be far larger, faster, and more aggressive than anticipated, with Lewis himself having a near-fatal encounter. Herds of bison, sometimes numbering in the thousands, thundered across the plains, their sheer numbers a sight of awe. Prairie dogs, another creature never before seen by the Americans, amazed Lewis so much that he spent a whole day trying to capture one to ship back to Jefferson alive. By October of 1804, after 5 grueling months and more than 600 miles on the river, they reached the Earth Lodge villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa tribes in present-day North Dakota. The air was growing colder, snow had begun to fall, and the Missouri was starting to ice over. Here, the Corps of Discovery would build Fort Mandan and prepare to spend the long, harsh winter among the tribes. They had come hundreds of miles, but they knew the hardest part of their journey still lay ahead. The towering, mysterious, rocky mountains were waiting, and so was the vast, silent unknown that lay beyond. As the mighty Missouri River froze solid and the deep snows of a North Dakota winter enveloped the plains, the Corps of Discovery settled into their new home, Fort Mandan. This was a crude but sturdy triangular structure, built from cottonwood logs, situated near the bustling Earth Lodge villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa tribes. It was now late 1804, and the expedition would remain here for 5 long months, a period of both hardship and critical preparation. Temperatures regularly plunged well below zero, and the wind howled across the open prairie with a ferocity that chilled the men to the bone. The Corps spent the season hunkered down, repairing their well-worn gear, hunting buffalo to restock their provisions, and, most importantly, interacting daily with their native hosts, whose generosity, knowledge, and strategic assistance would prove absolutely invaluable to the expedition's survival and future success. The Mandan and Hidatsa were not isolated, primitive bands. They were sophisticated agriculturalists and experienced traders, their villages forming a major commercial hub on the northern plains. Their communities bustled with activity even in the heart of winter, and their hospitality was crucial in helping the Corps endure the harsh conditions. They provided corn, squash, and other foods, shared knowledge of the local terrain, and offered insights into the geography and peoples that lay further west. But the two tribes also possessed something even more valuable than food: intelligence. They spoke of the immense, seemingly endless mountains that lay ahead, of distant rivers that flowed westward, and of a mysterious, horse-rich tribe known as the Shoshone, who lived near the western edge of the world known to them. This was the tribe that Lewis and Clark desperately needed to find. If there was any hope of crossing the formidable Rocky Mountains and reaching the Pacific, they understood they would need to trade for horses, and the Shoshone were known to have them in abundance. And it is here, in this frozen outpost, that one of the most famous and pivotal figures of the expedition enters the story: Sacagawea. During their stay, Lewis and Clark hired a French-Canadian fur trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau to serve as an interpreter. He came as part of a package deal, along with his young wife, a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea. She had been kidnapped from her people as a young girl during a raid and was later sold or gambled away to Charbonneau. Though still a teenager and pregnant with her first child at the time, Sacagawea quickly proved to be far more than just the trapper's wife. In February 1805, inside the cramped quarters of Fort Mandan, she gave birth to a son, Jean-Baptiste, whom Clark affectionately nicknamed Pomp or Pompey. Just 2 months later, with her infant son swaddled and slung on her back, Sacagawea set off with the Corps as they resumed their westward journey up the Missouri. Her presence fundamentally transformed the expedition. First, she was an interpreter, able to communicate directly with the Shoshone bands they would later encounter, a skill that would prove to be life-saving. Second, as a Shoshone herself, she knew some of the geography and edible plants of the lands ahead. And third, perhaps most importantly, her very presence was a symbol. A woman carrying a baby was an undeniable sign of peace to the many tribes they met along the way. War parties, as they all knew, did not bring families, with Sacagawea and her child among them. The cause of discovery was seen less as a threat and more as a peaceful, if strange, delegation. The Corps finally departed Fort Mandan in April 1805 with stronger supplies, better, if still incomplete, maps, and a new, quiet source of hope and guidance. Ahead of them lay roaring rivers, towering, unknown mountains, and challenges that none of them could have fully foreseen. But now they had Sacagawea, a silent force of resilience who would profoundly shape the fate of their mission. As the Corps of discovery pushed deeper into the heart of the continent in the spring of 1805, the character of the Missouri River began to change dramatically. The once wide and muddy current that had defined their journey across the plains now narrowed, its waters running clearer and faster as it twisted through the rugged, rocky valleys of what is now Montana. The landscape around them was no longer the gentle, rolling prairie. It was rising steeply, becoming more wild, more imposing. The expedition was entering the upper Missouri Basin, the foothills of the great Rocky Mountains, and the terrain itself was turning into their adversary. They soon encountered one of their most daunting physical challenges yet: the Great Falls of the Missouri. Instead of the single, manageable waterfall that Lewis had anticipated based on Native American accounts, they were confronted by a formidable series of 5 distinct, powerful waterfalls, creating a 21-mile obstacle of churning rapids, violent cascades, and impassable cliffs. The keelboat could go no further. The Corps had no choice but to carry their boats and tons of supplies across dry land in a brutal, month-long portage. It was an ordeal of almost unimaginable labor. The men hauled their heavy dugout canoes and thousands of pounds of cargo across miles of rough terrain, their feet pierced by the sharp spines of prickly pear cactus, their bodies tormented by swarms of biting insects and the relentless summer sun. They dragged the hulking boats over the rolling landscape using makeshift wheels that constantly broke under the strain. Despite the immense hardship, The successful completion of the portage was also a significant turning point. The very presence of the falls confirmed that the expedition was on the right track. Native accounts had described them, and reaching this landmark proved that the fabled Northwest Passage, if it existed at all, might lie just beyond the next mountain range. But the river did not, as they had hoped, lead them to an easy water route to the west. Instead, it led them straight into the seemingly impenetrable wall of the Rocky Mountains. By August of 1805, the Corps had reached the Three Forks of the Missouri, the point where the river splits into three distinct tributaries, which they named the Jefferson, the Madison, and the Gallatin. Following the advice of Sacagawea and local tribes, they chose to follow the Jefferson River, tracing the faint memories of Sacagawea's childhood in the desperate hope of finding her people, the Shoshone. Their need for horses was now critical. Soon, their persistence paid off. They encountered a small group of Shoshone, and, in an extraordinary, almost mythic twist of fate, the chief of this band turned out to be none other than Sacagawea's own brother, Kamiawait. The emotional reunion that followed, between a brother who thought his sister was long dead and a sister returning to her homeland, couldn't have come at a more crucial moment. Through Sacagawea's presence and the newfound trust established with her tribe, the Corps was able to secure the horses and guides that were essential for the next, most perilous leg of their journey. The dream of a continuous water route to the Pacific was now officially fading, but with Shoshone support and fresh horses, the daunting task of crossing the Rocky Mountains was, at last, possible. The river had carried them as far as it could. Now, it was the mountains that would truly test their resolve, and the next few weeks would prove to be the most grueling and life-threatening of the entire expedition. With their newly acquired Shoshone horses and the bitter realization that the dream of a Northwest Passage by water was officially dead, the course of discovery now faced their next and most grueling ordeal. Crossing the Bitterroots Mountains. This was a formidable, snow-cloaked range straddling western Montana and Idaho, a wilderness so rugged and unforgiving it made the eastern Rockies they had already traversed look like gentle, rolling hills. This part of the journey was no longer about exploration. It was about raw, desperate survival. Guided first by a Shoshone man named Old Toby, and later relying on the guidance of the Nez Perce tribe, Lewis and Clark led their weary men into the high, treacherous passes of the Bitterroots in early September 1805. Their timing could not have been worse. Early, unseasonable snowstorms began to lash the mountains, turning the already difficult journey into a frozen nightmare. The path, where it existed at all, was steep, narrow, and soon blanketed with several feet of snow. The men slipped and stumbled along icy, winding trails, their hands and faces cracking from the severe cold. The most formidable enemy, however, was hunger. Game was almost non-existent in the high altitudes. The men, burning thousands of calories a day in the freezing temperatures, were reduced to eating their precious emergency rations. And then, in a sign of growing desperation, their own horses. They also consumed candles made from tallow and made a thin, unappetizing soup by boiling their rawhide bags and leather belts. They scavenged for whatever edible roots they could find, guided by Sacagawea's knowledge. At times, the party could barely move a mile per day through the deep snow and tangled deadfall. By the time they finally descended from the mountains into the territory of the Nez Perce, the Corps was on the absolute brink of collapse. The men were emaciated, their bodies skeletal, their spirits frayed. They were exhausted, frostbitten, and barely alive. The Nez Perce tribe, encountering this ragged group of strangers, could have easily attacked and annihilated them. They had the numbers, they knew the terrain, and they had the element of complete surprise. But instead, in a pivotal moment of compassion that saved the expedition, the tribe chose mercy. The Nez Perce fed the starving men dried salmon and camas root, a starchy bulb that was a staple of their diet, and helped nurse them back to health over several weeks. It was another miraculous turn of fate. Without the aid and humanity of the Nez Perce, the Lewis and Clark expedition might have ended right there, its members buried in unmarked graves in a remote mountain pass. Once they recovered their strength, Lewis and Clark made arrangements with the Nez Perce to care for their horses until their return journey. They then set about building a new fleet of dugout canoes from the region's massive ponderosa pines. The rivers, now the Clearwater, the Snake, and eventually the mighty Columbia would carry them the rest of the way to the Pacific Ocean. But they carried with them a new, hard-won piece of knowledge. There was no direct, easy water route across the continent. The Northwest Passage, the dream that had fueled generations of explorers, simply did not exist. The mountains, vast and unforgiving, definitively cut the continent in half. Still, they had made it across the divide. The Corps pressed on, racing against the onset of another winter, braving new, turbulent rivers and new dangers, but their spirits were rising again. They had endured the worst that nature could throw at them, and the salty smell of the ocean was no longer a distant fantasy. It was real, and it was just ahead. In October of 1805, after months of unimaginable hardship, the Corps Discovery emerged from the wild, rugged interior of the continent and began their final descent down the mighty Columbia River, the great waterway that would, at last, lead them to the Pacific Ocean. For the first time in over a year, they were traveling with the current, not against it. The land around them was changing dramatically. The air grew wetter, the forests denser with towering evergreens, and the rivers teemed with such an abundance of salmon it seemed the water itself was alive. But this final leg was no smooth, easy sailing. The Columbia, though majestic, was a treacherous and powerful river. The men had to navigate through a series of dangerous rapids, churning whirlpools, and gorges lined with jagged rocks. One wrong move, one moment of inattention, could smash a canoe to splinters and send precious supplies, or even the men themselves, to the bottom of the river. Several boats did capsize, and critical equipment was lost. But through skill and sheer luck, no lives were. Along the way, they passed through the lands of powerful and populous tribes, including the Walla Walla, the Yakama, the Chinook, and others. Diplomacy and trade were a constant, daily necessity. In some encounters, tensions rose, especially when the Corps' rigid military discipline clashed with local tribal customs and expectations of trade. But no major battles broke out, and many tribes generously offered aid in the form of dried fish, edible roots, and invaluable information in exchange for the Corps' remaining trade goods, trinkets, knives, or the highly prized Jefferson silver peace medals. Then, in mid-November of 1805, after a journey of over 4,000 miles, they finally saw it, the Pacific Ocean, or more accurately, they first saw the vast, turbulent estuary of the Columbia River, churning with powerful tidal waves and battered by relentless coastal storm winds. William Clark famously wrote in his journal, "Ocean in view." The joy. They had made it after more than 18 months of struggle across rivers, plains, and mountains. The core of discovery had reached the far western edge of the continent. But the Pacific did not exactly roll out a red carpet for its weary visitors. The Corps reached just in time for a miserable, perpetually damp coastal winter. Rain fell for weeks on end. The winds howled incessantly. Their supplies were dangerously low, and the men were constantly cold and soaked to the bone. Finding food proved to be more difficult than they had expected, and trading with the local coastal tribes, who were shrewd and experienced negotiators, was often complicated. In a remarkable demonstration of the expedition's democratic spirit, the Corps held a vote to decide where to spend the winter. Every member, including Sacagawea and Clark's black slave, York, was given a voice, an almost unprecedented act of inclusivity for the era. They eventually selected a sheltered spot on the south side of the river. There, they constructed Fort Clatsop, near the site of modern-day Astoria, Oregon. They would remain in this damp, cramped fort for the next 4 long months, meticulously documenting the coastal wildlife, crafting detailed maps of the area, boiling seawater to make salt, and preparing themselves, both physically and mentally, for the long, arduous journey home. The mission was only half over, but the most perilous part, perhaps, still lay ahead, getting back to civilization, alive. In March of 1806, after 4 soggy, bone-chilling, and frankly miserable months at Fort Clatsop, the Corps of Discovery eagerly packed their worn-out gear, burned what they couldn't carry, and gratefully turned their faces eastward, beginning the long journey home. They had successfully reached the Pacific, a monumental achievement, but they all knew the return trip would be no victory lap. It was to be every bit as challenging, if not more so, than the journey west had been. Their supplies were nearly depleted. Their clothes were worn to literal rags, and the relentless spring rains of the Pacific Northwest turned the trails into a muddy, dispiriting quagmire. Once again, they had to rely on the generosity and trading savvy of native tribes to survive. They bartered what few valuable items they had left. Fish hooks, needles, the last of their trade goods for essential food, fresh horses, and crucial directions from the Clatsop, the Nez Perce, and the Walla Walla tribes. Recrossing the formidable Bitterroot Mountains was just as miserable as the first time. Even in late spring and early summer, snow still blanketed the high passes, and the scarcity of game meant hunger was once again their constant, unwelcome companion. The men were thinner now, hungrier, and more weathered by their long ordeal, but they were also more experienced. What had once been a journey into the terrifying unknown was now a grim but navigable trek through familiar, if still dangerous, territory. After successfully crossing the Continental Divide, Lewis and Clark made a bold and strategic decision. They would split the corps into two smaller groups in order to explore and map more of the Louisiana Territory on their return. Lewis would lead a party north toward the Marias River, hoping to better define the northern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase. Clark, meanwhile, would lead another group south to follow and chart the course of the Yellowstone River, searching for easier routes through the vast plains. It was a calculated risk. Communication between the two groups would be impossible, and they would be more vulnerable to attack. Lewis's path, in particular, turned nearly fatal. In late July, his group had a tense encounter with a party of Blackfeet warriors. The Blackfeet, wary of American encroachment and their alliances with rival tribes, were suspicious of the expedition's motives. One tense night, a skirmish broke out when the Blackfeet attempted to steal the Americans' guns and horses. In the ensuing fight, 2 Blackfeet men were killed in the only violent, fatal conflict of the entire 2.5-year expedition. Lewis's small party fled under the cover of darkness, shaken, wounded, and pursued. Clark's group had a slightly less dramatic, though still challenging, return journey. They successfully built new canoes, were briefly reunited with Sacagawea and her family, and navigated the length of the Yellowstone with relative success, despite facing their own share of injuries and hair-raising bison stampedes. By August of 1806, near the confluence of the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers, the two groups finally reunited. The expedition was whole again, but the mood was somber, a mix of relief and exhaustion. The initial thrill of discovery had long since passed. Now, all that remained was the final, grinding paddle home, down the familiar waters of the Missouri. Tired, scarred, but miraculously alive. By late August of 1806, the powerful current of the Missouri River was once again the ally of the corps of discovery, this time pulling them swiftly downstream, carrying them not toward mystery and the unknown, but toward home. Their bodies were thinner, their buckskin uniforms were in tatters, their faces were weathered by sun and wind, and their precious journals were swollen with mud-stained, water-warped pages, but they had survived. On September the 23rd, 1806, the expedition finally returned to St. Louis, greeted not with a grand, orchestrated fanfare, but with stunned, disbelieving awe. They had been gone for over 2 years, and many in the United States had long presumed them lost to the wilderness, dead and forgotten. Their reappearance was like a resurrection. In just over 2 years, Lewis and Clark had led their team over 8,000 miles. They had crossed the formidable Rocky Mountains, navigated roaring, uncharted rivers, made peaceful contact with more than 50 distinct Native American tribes, and meticulously recorded hundreds of previously unknown plant and animal species. They had mapped vast portions of the North American continent with astonishing, almost unprecedented accuracy, and had firmly established an American presence in lands long claimed by not only indigenous nations, but also by rival European powers like Britain and Spain. The expedition was immediately hailed as a national triumph. Newspapers across the young republic celebrated their incredible survival and their monumental discoveries. President Jefferson, who had waited anxiously for any word of their fate, was elated. His vision had been realized, And then some. The scientific specimens alone were astonishing. New plants, new animals, detailed fossils, and even live creatures like prairie dogs and magpies were carefully sent on to Washington. The detailed ethnographic accounts of the numerous native nations, their customs, their languages, their political structures became essential, if often ignored. Reading for future explorers, traders, and government policymakers. But for the two captains who had led this epic journey, the story did not end so cleanly or triumphantly. William Clark went on to a long and distinguished public career. He became the governor of the Missouri Territory and later the superintendent of Indian Affairs. He raised Sacagawea's son, Jean-Baptiste, whom he had nicknamed Pomp, as his own, and he continued to engage with native tribes throughout his life, sometimes as a trusted friend, other times as a reluctant enforcer of the very expansion he had helped set in motion. Meriwether Lewis, however, struggled to find his footing back in civilization. Appointed as the governor of the vast Louisiana Territory, he was plagued by political conflicts, mounting debts, and a deepening battle with what we would now likely recognize as severe depression and alcoholism. Just 3 years after the expedition's triumphant return, in 1809, Lewis died under mysterious and tragic circumstances, either by suicide or murder, at a remote inn along the Natchez Trace in Tennessee. He was only 35 years old. His untimely death cast a long, dark shadow over the mission he had once led with such brilliant precision and purpose. And what of Sacagawea, the young Shoshone woman whose quiet strength was so essential to the Corps' survival? Her life, after the expedition, remains partly veiled in historical uncertainty. Most records suggest she died young, in 1812, though some tribal oral traditions claim she lived much longer, eventually returning to her people. What is clear and undeniable is that her presence was critical. Without her skills as an interpreter, her knowledge of the terrain and edible plants, and her symbolic power as a woman with a child, the Corps might never have successfully navigated the Rockies or gained the trust of key tribes like the Shoshone. Her strength, endurance, and quiet intelligence fundamentally changed the fate of the expedition, even if the history books, for a long time, did not give her the full credit she so richly deserved. The Corps of Discovery reshaped how Americans saw their country. They proved that the continent, while vast, was not impassable. They demonstrated that it was interconnected, rich in resources, and already inhabited by diverse, sovereign nations. In doing so, they opened a door that would soon be flooded with settlers, soldiers, traders, and relentless ambition. Lewis and Clark didn't just explore a new land. They stood at the edge of something far larger, the complex, often brutal, and world-changing future of the United States. And after their journey, that future and the continent itself would never be the same. What an absolutely epic tale of survival, discovery, and the complex beginnings of American expansion. What part of the Lewis and Clark expedition do you find the most incredible or most thought-provoking? I would love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the American West. If this story of courage and consequence resonated with you, please give this video a like. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the pivotal moments that shaped our world. Until then, keep exploring and stay curious.